On a historic ranch in the heart of the Texas Hill Country, a man discovered on the eve of his own daughter's wedding a secret that could destroy everything he had built over a lifetime. The bride smiled, completely unaware. The groom, who had arrived with charm and all the right words, was keeping a hidden scheme that no one had noticed yet. No one except this father. What he decided to do, silently, alone, waiting for the exact right moment, will change what you believe about love, loyalty, and the weight of truth when it arrives at a time that cannot be avoided. But before we reveal this mystery, tell me in the comments, which city in the world are you listening to us from? And if you enjoy moving stories like this one, subscribe to the channel. It's a simple gesture that truly helps our work. The dust kicked up by the dry October wind had not yet settled over the yard of the Alencar Ranch when Anthony Alencar stepped out onto the porch of the main house and let his gaze drift across the land that time had turned into an extension of his own body. 1,200 acres of tamed Texas scrub, barbed wire fences he himself had helped sink into the earth back when his knees were still good, a pond that had never run dry in 40 years, and a small stone chapel whose walls held the baptisms and heartaches of 3 generations of his family. It was everything he had. In truth, it was everything he was. Evening settled slowly over the Fredericksburg Hills, painting the horizon in a shade of orange that looked like a controlled wildfire. Down below, in the ranch courtyard, the women hired for the preparations arranged long tables under the sprawling live oaks, hung white and yellow ribbons from the branches, and wrestled with the wind over the placement of every floral arrangement. Flowers were everywhere: white carnations, pearl-colored gerbera daisies, sprigs of aromatic eucalyptus scenting air already thick with the smell of red dirt and open pasture. The Alencar Ranch had never hosted so many guests. Anthony knew that. And he also knew, with a clarity that hurt worse than anything physical, that the celebration being set up down there was no cause for genuine joy. He pulled off his straw hat and ran a hand over his head, where his white hair resisted with the same stubbornness that had always defined him as a man. 72 years of living in the hill country teach a man to tell the smell of a good rain from the smell of a rain that destroys. And what Anthony smelled right now, mixed with the perfume of flowers planted specifically for tomorrow's wedding, was destruction. Not the visible kind that announces itself with thunder and leaves immediate scars. The other kind. The kind that creeps in softly, in polished shoes and a carefully rehearsed smile. The little stone chapel on the south side of the property stood as it always had, its thick stone walls whitewashed dozens of times without ever losing the rough irregularity of the original build. That was where everything would happen the next day. The wedding of Isabella Marie Alencar, his only daughter, his only heir, the only heart Anthony still had the habit of guarding with the ferocity of a wild animal. The wedding that, over the past few weeks, had begun to take on the dark outline of a well-laid trap. Isabella appeared through the side door of the house in a light blue rehearsal dress that fluttered in the breeze. Her face was open in a wide smile, her hair pinned up haphazardly at the nape of her neck, her steps carrying a lightness that, under any other circumstances, would have filled her father's heart with pure gratitude. She was the daughter born to be the joy of that place. Ever since she was a little girl, she had climbed trees with the same natural grace with which she recited poetry. And there was something about the way she moved through the world that reminded Anthony of his fondest memories of his late wife. A memory he held on to so gently that he never spoke it aloud, as if mere words might wear it away. But Isabella was 18. And 18 is the age when the heart makes decisions faster than the mind can keep up. She waved to her father when she caught sight of him on the porch, and he responded with a hand gesture that tried to appear serene. She crossed the yard like someone dancing without knowing she was dancing, greeted the decorating crew with that warm familiarity everyone on the ranch loved about her, straightened a ribbon that had fallen from a branch, and disappeared toward the chapel to check on the interior arrangements. Anthony watched her every step with the intense focus of a man who knows he is seeing something for the last time in its original form. Tomorrow his daughter would be someone else, or at least that was what the man who had asked for her hand planned to happen. Roderick Palmer had entered Isabella's life with the precision of someone surveying a territory before moving in. Anthony had noticed it from the start, but he had made the mistake all fathers make with a daughter they love too much. He had mistaken intuition for jealousy, drowning out the inner voice telling him that Smile was far too calculated for someone with only 22 years behind him. Roderick knew how to shake a hand at just the right moment, knew when to speak and when to stay quiet, knew how to steer a conversation wherever he wanted without anyone noticing the maneuver. He had the manners of someone very well raised, but by whom, where, and at what cost, Anthony had never been able to uncover with the depth the matter deserved. And that, in itself, was an answer he should have listened to more closely from the beginning. Earlier that day, before the sun reached its peak, Anthony had seen the young man pacing the perimeter of the property with slow, calculated steps, hands folded behind his back, his eyes sweeping the pasture lands like someone taking inventory. There was something in the angle of that look that Anthony recognized from somewhere, not the look of a man admiring what he sees, but of someone measuring, weighing, calculating how much he can take. Anthony had stood behind the office window, watching unseen, and for the first time since the young man had entered his life through the front door, he allowed himself to name precisely what he felt. Suspicion. Not a vague doubt, but a certainty that merely lacked the proof needed to be spoken aloud. There was something Anthony had never told anyone, not even Raymond. 3 nights ago, unable to sleep, he had sat in his office past midnight, rereading for the 10th time corporate documents Roderick had casually mentioned over dinner, referring to a business he'd described as a promising investment. There was something in those numbers, in those vague terms, and in that company without a fixed address that stirred the same hard-earned instinct Anthony had honed over decades of running the ranch. The feeling that someone was unlocking a back door while everyone else had their eyes glued to the front entrance. The sun sank another notch toward the horizon. Raymond Miller, manager of the ranch for over 2 decades, and the living memory of everything the land had witnessed, rounded the side of the barn with slow, deliberate steps. He was a man of few words and many things held in the corners of his eyes. Anthony had watched him grow up there, had seen his hair turn grey at the same speed his own had, and between them lay the kind of understanding that required no lengthy explanations and could bear long silences as if they were full conversations. Raymond climbed the porch steps without being called, leaned against a century-old wooden post, and stood staring out at the same horizon his boss was watching. Neither spoke for a while. The women down below continued their work, and the warm wind carried fragments of conversations that never quite finished. It was Raymond who broke the silence, but carefully, like a man testing a floorboard that might not hold his weight. The Palmers arrive in the morning. They brought more people than expected. He paused for a moment. There's a lawyer in the group. Isabella didn't invite him. Anthony slowly turned his head to the manager. In his eyes burned a controlled fire, the kind of blaze that doesn't crackle because it has been disciplined over decades not to waste unnecessary heat. He let the silence do the work of a question. "I know more than I've let on," Raymond continued, his voice low, as if the wind might carry the words to the wrong ears. "About this kid, about his family, about where he really comes from. But I needed time to be sure before bringing it to you." "How much more time do you need?" "None. I don't need any more time." Anthony nodded slowly, with the precision of a man who wastes no movement. It was the confirmation of what his gut had diagnosed weeks ago during those dinners where he watched Roderick move around the estate, with the subtle arrogance of someone who already feels like he owns what he hasn't yet signed for. In the young man's gestures, Anthony recognized something familiar, the inventory-taking gaze a man casts when calculating the value of what he plans to seize. "Tell me later," he said, with a firmness that left no room for debate. "Not here." Raymond headed down the porch without another word, leaving Anthony alone with the twilight and the burden he had decided to carry in silence for a few more hours. Not because he was a coward. No man who had built what he built could ever be accused of cowardice. But because Isabella was happy down there, with the lightness in her eyes of someone who hasn't yet learned that the world charges a heavy price for innocence. And happiness, even when built on sand, deserves to last as long as it can. Inside the house, preparations continued at a feverish pace. Mrs. Hilda, the cook who had served the family for 15 years, moved through the rooms with the authority of someone who knew every corner by heart, organizing details and answering the helpers' questions with the practical sharpness of a woman with no time for drama. But even she, who rarely raised her eyes from her work, had noticed something different about the rancher today. She had seen the way he stared at the horizon, with that quiet stillness that wasn't peace, and she had silently whispered a prayer she herself couldn't quite name. Isabella returned from the chapel, her face still glowing with excitement, holding the bouquet of carnations up against the fabric she had chosen for tomorrow's dress, asking her father what he thought of the match. Anthony looked at the flowers, then at his daughter, and made the quietest effort of his life. He smiled. Not the broad smile she was waiting for, but enough so she wouldn't see what lay beneath it. "It looks beautiful," he said. "Roderick is arriving early tomorrow," she said, her eyes lit with that spark that only exists when you're 18 and completely, for the first time, surrendered to someone. "He told me he has a surprise for me before the ceremony." Anthony rested his hand on his daughter's shoulder with a lightness that cost him more than she would ever know. "Go get some rest, sweetheart. Tomorrow is going to be a very long day." Isabella walked off humming, taking with her the flowers and the carefree ease of someone carrying no weight at all, while Anthony stood facing the portrait of his wife that hung on the living room's main wall. He stared into those painted eyes that still held the serene stubbornness of her living days, and he stayed like that for a long while, like a man seeking permission, or simply a witness, for what he intended to do. Outside, the night-blooming jasmine beneath the office window began releasing its thick, sweet perfume. That scent Anthony had come to associate with moments when the ranch took a deep breath before an irreversible change. The last sliver of light faded behind the rocky hills of the hill country, and night fell over the Alencar ranch with the deceptive softness of nights that precede great storms. Night had swallowed the yard of the Alencar ranch by the time the last chairs were pushed away from the dinner table and the glasses of cold peach iced tea were cleared away by Mrs. Hilda with the silent swiftness of someone who is exhausted, but will never admit it. Dinner had been, on the surface, exactly what it was supposed to be, a cordial gathering, full of shared smiles and polished stories. Roderick's mother, a soft-spoken woman named Eleanor, had praised the food with an enthusiasm that felt genuine. His father, a burly man named Ernest, had sipped his tea with the quiet reserve of someone unaccustomed to being the center of attention. And Roderick had steered the conversation as he always did, with the ease of a man born knowing where to place every word, so it produces the desired effect. Isabella laughed. Isabella agreed. Isabella looked at her fiancé with that absolute devotion Anthony had come to recognize as the clearest sign that his daughter had already made up her mind, regardless of anything he could say. Anthony had stayed quiet through most of the meal, answering when asked, smiling when necessary, and watching. He had watched the way Roderick, when speaking of the future, always made gestures that encompassed the space around them, a sweeping movement of his hands that seemed to want to embrace the entire property. He had watched how the young man, when mentioning plans that didn't yet exist, always used the possessive "our" in a way that slipped subtly between the personal and the financial, like someone testing the weight of a word before putting it on a legal deed. And above all, he had watched how the lawyer who had traveled with them, briefly introduced as a friend of the family, Mr. Fletcher, had remained in absolute silence throughout the meal, eyes cast down at his plate like a man who preferred not to be remembered. Right after dinner, with the house still smelling of food and the guests retiring to their rooms, Anthony had caught Raymond in the hallway and given the only sign needed, a slight nod toward the office. The ranch had gone completely still by the time Anthony lit the brass desk lamp and closed the door with the care of a man who doesn't want to be overheard. The room smelled of old paper, the leather bindings of accounting ledgers, and the cedar drawers that had never needed a lock because, until recently, Anthony had never imagined there would be anything to hide inside them. Raymond slipped in a few minutes later, holding a folded brown envelope and wearing the expression of a man who had spent too long carrying something he should have put on the table much sooner. He shut the door behind him, pulled up the chair facing the desk, and sat down with the heavy posture of someone who hadn't slept properly in days. "Tell me," Anthony said simply. Raymond opened the envelope and spread several sheets across the desk. They weren't official documents. There were handwritten notes, cutouts, and copies of records obtained through contacts in Austin, where he had quietly traveled 2 weeks earlier under the pretense of settling ranch business. "The Palmers aren't Palmers," he said, his voice carrying more weight the lower it got. "I mean, the name exists, but the family Roderick describes doesn't exist the way he describes it. His father has no property registered in the state, no ranch, no cattle, nothing, he told Isabella when he was introduced. What does exist is a family from Waco living modestly, sharing the same surname by genealogical coincidence, but with no connection to the image this boy built in everyone's minds." Anthony said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the papers spread on the desk without picking them up, as if he needed to process the words before he needed the proof. "And the business?" he asked, his voice dropping 2 octaves. Raymond turned to the next sheet. "That took the most time. There's a company registered in Austin 7 months ago, a shell name, a corporate board with 2 names I can't clearly trace, and an address that leads to a co-working office downtown near Westlake." He tapped his finger lightly on the sheet. "The lawyer who had dinner here tonight is a partner in that company. The wall clock struck 11 with that mechanical calm that feels unsettling on tense nights." Anthony stood up slowly, walked to the window, and stood gazing at the dark yard where the last decoration lights still flickered, tied to the trees, like captured fireflies. The long tables were set, waiting for tomorrow's feast. The chapel was prepared, the flowers were in place, everything in its right order, everything set for a party he needed to stop without bringing the entire ranch down with it. He planned all of this before asking for her hand, Anthony said, more to himself than to Raymond. Probably even before that. Raymond carefully folded the sheets and slipped them back into the envelope. "But you need to understand, I have solid suspicions. I have leads. What I don't have yet is the document that ties it all into a knot he can't untie with a smooth speech at the wrong moment." "What document?" "The one he intends to have her sign. If I'm right about what I'm thinking, he's going to present something to Isabella right after the ceremony, something she'll sign without reading because she trusts him." Raymond paused. "I need to see that document so you have what you need in hand." "How do you get that?" "I don't know yet, but I have tomorrow morning." Anthony nodded and dismissed the manager with a gesture that was both gratitude and a demand for absolute secrecy. Raymond left down the hallway with his usual quiet stride, and Anthony was left alone with the echoes of the clock chimes that had faded into the silence, bearing the weight of information that couldn't be undone simply by wishing it weren't true. He walked back to the desk and stared at the empty space where the papers had been. What disturbed him most wasn't the lie itself. In the hill country, lies were as old as the hills, and he had learned to live alongside them since he was a young man. What disturbed him was the sheer scale of the planning, because lying out of vanity is one thing. Lying 7 months in advance with a registered shell company, a traveling lawyer, and documents likely already drawn up, that was something else entirely. That was architecture. And architecture on that scale isn't built by accident, nor to satisfy a passing ambition. Someone was coaching this boy, or someone behind him knew exactly what this ranch was worth taking. There was also something that hurt in a way Anthony hadn't expected. It wasn't anger, which he had always known how to manage. It was the quiet humiliation of having been sized up as a target, of having his daughter, his ranch, his whole life weighed and appraised by a boy who had walked through the front door with the smile of someone who owed nothing to anyone. More than an hour later, when the silence had become absolute, Anthony turned off the lamp and walked down the dark hallway. As he passed the dining room, he heard footsteps upstairs, light footsteps he had recognized ever since their owner had first learned to walk. Isabella was still awake, likely packing the last few things with the frantic energy of someone who can't sleep on the eve of what she considered the greatest moment of her life. Anthony stood in the dark for a few moments, listening to his daughter's steps move across the bedroom floor above, like a familiar melody. He thought about going up. He thought about knocking on the door, sitting on the edge of the bed, like he used to when she was little, and telling her everything. The talk with Raymond, the papers spread on the desk, the lawyer who was a partner in a shell company, the family from Waco who wasn't who they claimed to be. He thought about watching her face change. He didn't go up. There was a specific kind of pain that only exists between a father and daughter. The pain of knowing the truth will hurt worse than the lie. At least tonight. At least until he had everything he needed in hand, so there would be no room for debate. Because Isabella loved him, but she also loved Roderick, and young love has a brutal capacity to invent excuses for the inexplicable when it wants to protect what it believes it has. Anthony went out to the porch one last time that night. The hill country was quiet, with the kind of stillness that isn't peace but restraint, the same silence that precedes summer thunderstorms when the air grows heavy before everything breaks apart. The stars hung clear and cold over the limestone hills, and the scent of the night flowers still filled the air with their unsettling sweetness. He thought of Roderick's face at dinner, the fluency with which he had shifted topics when mentioning the business, the natural ease with which he had redirected the conversation before any question could form. It was elegance, yes, but it was the elegance of someone who had rehearsed for months. Anthony knew with the calm certainty of men who don't need to shout to be sure what he was going to do. Not tonight, not in the morning, but at the right moment, in the right place, when there would be no escaping the truth from any side. The land had taught him that the best time to act isn't in the heat of rage, it's when the other person already believes he has won. The ranch slept, Anthony did not. If what Raymond revealed tonight gripped you the same way it gripped Anthony, subscribe to the channel. It's a simple gesture that truly helps our work. And stay with us, because the document this young man prepared in the shadows hasn't come to light yet. And when it does, it will change everything. The sun rose over the hills, as it always rises in the heart of Texas, suddenly, without asking permission, painting the horizon in violet and orange before anyone was ready to receive it. Anthony was on the porch when it happened. He hadn't slept. He had stayed in that wicker chair until dawn, his head slightly tilted and his eyes open to the darkness that dissolved before him like sugar in warm water. He didn't move. He listened to the ranch wake up around him, the crowing of the rooster in the coop, the lowing of the cows in the barn, Mrs. Hilda's first footsteps in the kitchen, and the smell of coffee that began seeping through the window frame with the persistence of simple things that keep existing, even when the world around them is about to collapse. He stood up when the coffee was ready. He walked into the kitchen, accepted the mug Mrs. Hilda handed him without asking questions. She had the good sense of someone who notices when silence is more necessary than company, and drank it, standing up, looking out at the yard that was already coming alive with the first helpers arriving for final preparations. The flowers had survived the night. The centerpiece on the main table was intact. The ranch looked completely ready to host a wedding. Anthony finished his coffee and went to change his clothes. He had a role to play today, and playing it well was the only advantage he had left. Roderick arrived before 8 in the morning. Anthony saw him from the second-floor hallway, through the window overlooking the ranch entrance. The young man stepped out of the car with ease, a folded handkerchief in his suit pocket, carrying in his left hand a small box wrapped in navy blue velvet and tied with a cream ribbon. He brought only his driver with him. No lawyer, no family members, just him, the package, and that smile Anthony had spent the entire night learning to hate with precision. Isabella came down the stairs, as if the sun had walked through the front door. She was still in her robe, her hair loose, wearing the look of someone receiving the best news before the day had even begun. Roderick greeted her with a tenderness that seemed innocent and handed her the small package with the calculated ceremony of someone who knows he is being watched. She opened it with the eager speed of someone who has never lost her wonder for new things and pulled out an antique gold locket on a delicate, thin chain. Roderick explained that it had belonged to his family's grandmother, an heirloom he wanted her to wear at the altar. Isabella pressed her hand to her chest, her eyes shining. She hugged her fiancé. She said something Anthony couldn't hear from upstairs. Anthony turned his back to the window. There was something unsettling about the perfection of that gesture. A family locket, delivered on the morning of the wedding, with a touching story tied to it like a velvet ribbon. It was the kind of detail that seals open hearts and silences questions that might arise later. It wasn't a gift. It was an emotional investment, the final one to be made before the papers needed to be signed. Raymond appeared in the hallway at 9 in the morning, with the grim expression of someone carrying news he didn't quite know how to categorize. "I found it," he said in a whisper, leaning against the hallway wall so no one passing through the courtyard could see them together. "The document. A copy. It's in a black leather folder Mr. Fletcher left in the side pocket of his bag in the car. The trunk was cracked open when I checked the parking area early this morning. Raymond paused. I didn't take it. I took pictures with my phone. Anthony extended his hand. Raymond handed him the device with the screen already open to the first photo. The image was slightly crooked, taken in a hurry, but the text was clear enough for the words to hit with the force of a conclusion he already knew he would find. Transfer of ownership, receiving company, recording timeline, signee's authorization. And below, in a section Anthony read twice to make sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him, Isabella Marie Alencar's full name, printed in the field reserved for the grantor. "How many pages?" he asked, his voice that of a man who already knows he won't like the answer. "6. I photographed all of them, but the last page is blurry." The manager hesitated. "That's right where the irrevocable clauses are." Anthony handed the phone back slowly. Irrevocability was the detail that mattered. Without it, the document could be contested given time and patience. With it, a single signature would be enough to strip the land from the family's hands before any appeal could even be filed. "Hold on to those," Anthony said. "Don't show anyone." The day progressed with the specific cruelty of days that cannot be rushed. Guests arrived in clusters. Neighbors from nearby ranches, acquaintances from Fredericksburg, distant relatives Anthony saw only when the ranch needed to look united for the outside world. There were laughs in the yard, hugs, greetings, the strumming of the acoustic guitar duo hired for the pre-ceremony lunch. The ranch smelled of an authentic celebration, and that made it all the more unbearable to witness. Anthony moved among the guests with the composure it had taken him decades to build. He greeted people, chatted, accepted compliments about the property with the modesty of a man whose mind was elsewhere. He spotted Mr. Fletcher among the crowd, dapper, discreet, always hovering slightly on the fringes of the liveliest conversations, like a witness who prefers not to leave fingerprints. Their eyes locked once, and the lawyer looked away with an overstated naturalness, the kind that only exists when it's rehearsed. Isabella crossed the yard 3 times that morning, more radiant each time, more details of her dress finished each time, the gold locket around her neck reflecting the October sunlight with the painful innocence of beautiful things that carry weight without knowing it. Around noon, when the bustle was at its height and the collective chatter of the guests had turned the yard into a constant murmur, Anthony felt an urgent need for a moment of quiet. He retreated to the office through the side door, leaving it cracked open behind him, and walked over to his desk to organize his thoughts. There was a sequence of actions that needed to be clear in his head before the ceremony started, and the commotion outside threatened to jumble everything. He stood there for a few minutes, his back to the door, looking out the windows toward the open pasture. That 1,200-acre horizon that had been his for 40 years. That land his father had handed down to him with calloused hands, and the simple instruction that family land is never sold, never mortgaged, and never handed over to anyone who doesn't carry family blood in their veins. Then he heard footsteps approaching in the hallway. 2 pairs. One he recognized immediately by its firm, slightly drawn-out cadence, footsteps that had learned to move with authority inside that house. The other was faster, more restrained, with the precision of someone accustomed to moving through places where he prefers not to be noticed. Anthony didn't hesitate. The office had only one exit. He took 2 steps toward the heaviest bookcase in the room, the one pressed against the back wall, filled with 30 years of accounting ledgers, bound in numbered spines that recorded every inch of soil, every head of cattle, every harvest on this ranch, and slipped behind it at the exact moment the door opened with a soft click. Roderick walked in. Right behind him, carrying the black leather folder under his arm and his glasses sitting low on his nose, was Mr. Fletcher. Roderick closed the door. He checked the window. He swept his eyes around the room, confirming they were alone. And then he turned to the lawyer with an expression Anthony had never seen on that face before, because it was the expression of someone who had just taken off his mask, in a room he believed to be completely empty. "Is everything ready?" Roderick asked, his voice carrying a confidence entirely different from the one he displayed at dinners, in hugs, in stories told around the table. It was the voice of a man who didn't need to please anyone. Anthony stood frozen behind the bookcase, holding his breath. his back pressed against the books that documented the entire history of this land. On the other side of the woodwork, Mr. Fletcher unclasped the leather folder with a sharp metallic snap. The afternoon could wait. The wedding could wait. In that office, amid the ledgers that had recorded every decision of the Alencar family for 3 generations, the conversation that would change everything was about to begin. The only sound in the office was the breeze coming through the cracked window and the quiet creak of the books on the shelves whenever the wind blew harder. Anthony didn't take a deep breath. He held the air in his lungs in controlled amounts, like a man who had learned to conserve what he needed to stay on his feet. On the other side of the bookcase, Roderick stood still for a moment, the lawyer holding the open leather folder in front of him. "Is the irrevocability clause confirmed?" Roderick asked, his voice needing no volume to carry weight. "It is." Mr. Fletcher flipped to the last page with the ease of someone who had reviewed the document so many times he knew every line by heart. "Once signed, the instrument takes immediate effect and cannot be challenged without specific litigation. The window for any formal contestation is 90 days, and within that time the transfer will already be recorded at the county clerk's office." Roderick looked at the paper for a few seconds. "And the name of the acquiring company isn't blatantly obvious on a first read." "The structure was designed for that. The commercial name is on page 4, embedded inside a technical paragraph. To someone reading quickly and in full trust, it passes completely unnoticed." Anthony felt his hands clench into fists behind the bookcase. Not out of anger. Anger was too simple for what he was feeling. It was something deeper and colder than anger. It was the physical confirmation of a suspicion that, until that moment, had still harbored a remote chance of being wrong. It wasn't wrong. "You leave now," Roderick said with a short nod. "And don't show up in any ceremony photos." Mr. Fletcher closed the folder, adjusted his glasses with a precise flick, and slipped down the hallway without the sound of his steps revealing urgency or hesitation. Just efficiency. The office fell silent. Anthony remained motionless. Roderick stood in the center of the room, facing the windows overlooking the pasture, hands in his pockets, wearing the calm expression of a man staring out at a property he already considered his own. It was a brief moment, 3-4 seconds at most, but long enough for Anthony to etch that look into his memory with the sharpness of things that are never forgotten. Then the door opened again, preceded by a soft knock. "Roderick?" It was Isabella's voice, low and slightly surprised. "Mrs. Hilda told me you came in here. What are you doing in my father's office?" Roderick turned around with his smile already in place, as if it had been put there a fraction of a second before she could see. "Just catching my breath. It's getting a little too lively out there for my taste." He opened his arms slightly. "You look beautiful." Isabella stepped inside, her wedding dress still unfinished. The last button along her back needed fastening, and she accepted his embrace with that complete surrender that was the hallmark of a love she didn't know was being used as a weapon. Anthony closed his eyes for a second. Then he opened them. He couldn't afford to miss a single syllable. "We shouldn't be in here," Isabella said, a smile in her voice. "If my father catches you here before the wedding, your father will understand." Roderick ran a hand through her hair with a tenderness so well executed it felt real. "Besides, I needed to see you before everything gets started. There's something I want to tell you." Isabella pulled back slightly to look at him better. "What is it?" Roderick paused with that skill of building silences that mimic genuine emotion. "After the ceremony, Fletcher has a few papers for us to sign. Just a legal formality." He said it with the casual tone one uses to comment on the weather. "It's an instrument to establish joint asset protection, so that everything that becomes ours starting today is legally protected, in both our names." Isabella knitted her brow slightly, not out of suspicion, but with the look of someone trying to process something outside her realm of experience. "What kind of protection?" "The kind that ensures no unexpected turn in the future, separates what we're building together." Roderick took her hand. "It's simple. You sign, I sign, and from then on, everything sits inside a legal structure that shields us as a couple." Isabella looked at him for a moment. "The ranch?" she asked, with an innocence that pierced straight through Anthony like a blade. "A portion of it. The portion you'll bring as the foundation of our joint estate." Roderick said it with such casual ease, it sounded as if they had been married for years and were discussing routine paperwork. It's what lawyers call a protective transfer instrument. Nothing out of the ordinary. Isabella nodded slowly. Her face bore the expression of someone who doesn't fully understand, but trusts completely. And that combination was more painful to Anthony than any argument he could have crafted against the boy. Because it wasn't ignorance. It was love. And Isabella's love was being used as the entry point for a plan she had never been truly invited to know. "All right," she said simply. "If you say it's necessary, I trust you." Roderick smiled, and this time, from the angle where Anthony was standing, the smile looked different from every other smile he had catalogued over the past few months. It was the smile of a man who had just heard the password he'd been waiting for. "Then it's settled," he said. "Once the preacher finishes, we'll spend a few minutes with Fletcher and head over to the reception." They left together, Isabella laughing at something Roderick whispered in the hallway, and the door closed with the same soft click with which it had opened. Anthony stayed behind the bookcase for a span of time he couldn't measure. When he finally took his first step out, he realized his legs were stiff, not from fear, but from the kind of tension the body accumulates when the mind works at the edge of what it can process without shattering. He stood in the center of the office, in the exact spot Roderick had stood seconds earlier, looking out at the same windows, the same open pasture, the same stretch of land 3 generations of his family had watered with sweat and silence. The October sun streamed through the glass panes with that flat light that spares no one, and Anthony stood in that light for a long while, letting it illuminate everything with the raw clarity the moment demanded. He had what he needed now. No more suspicions, no more hunches that could be dismissed as a father's jealousy or overprotectiveness. He had words. He had Roderick's own voice describing the scheme with the nonchalance of a man who never imagined anyone was listening on the other side of the bookshelf. He had the company name, the document structure, the lawyer's confirmation. He had everything. And he had something else, something that hurt in a way he hadn't yet found the right name for. He had heard his daughter say, "I trust you," to a man who didn't deserve to be trusted with a glass of water. And he had heard it unable to say a word, unable to move a single muscle, unable to make the one gesture a father wants to make when his daughter is about to step into harm's way, putting his body in front of her. There was a ceremony starting in less than 2 hours. There were guests in the courtyard, a preacher on his way, white flowers everywhere, and a gold locket around Isabella's neck that she wore as a family heirloom, and that was likely as fake as everything else. Anthony stepped out of the office slowly, closed the door carefully behind him, and walked down the hallway toward the yard with the absolute serenity of a man who had made a decision from which there was no turning back. There was no more room for hesitation, for the weight of a broken heart, or for the fear of hurting his daughter. There was only one question left: where and when? And the answer, Anthony already knew, lay inside the small stone chapel on the south side of the property. It lay in the silence that falls right before the preacher asks the question that cannot be left unanswered. If the conversation Anthony overheard in that office touched you the same way it touched him, subscribe to the channel. It's a simple gesture that truly helps our work, and don't go anywhere, because what this man plans to do at the altar of that little chapel is going to change everything you think you know about this story. Anthony walked down the hallway with the slow pace of a man who needs his feet to arrive before his mind, because his mind was still stuck in that office, still hearing Roderick's voice describe the transfer with the same light-heartedness used to describe a stroll, still hearing Isabella say, "I trust you," with that devastating naturalness of someone who had never learned that trust could be used as a weapon. He found Raymond outside near the equipment barn, pretending to check the ropes on the canopy tent set up for the reception. Anthony approached from behind, unhurried, appearing like a man taking a routine walk around the property. He leaned against the wooden post beside the manager and stared straight ahead. "I heard everything," he said without preamble in a barely audible whisper. Raymond didn't turn around. His hands stayed busy with the rope, but his fingers stopped moving. "How?" "I went into the office before them, slipped behind the bookcase when they walked in." Anthony paused. "Fletcher confirmed the irrevocability clause. The company name is buried on page 4, and Roderick already told Isabella he'll need her to sign right after the ceremony. Told her it's joint asset protection." Raymond froze for a second. She believed him. It wasn't a question. Anthony didn't answer. The answer lived in the silence between them, and both men knew the exact weight of that silence. "I have the photos of the document," Raymond said at last. "Even with the last page blurry, what's readable is enough to show any judge what this contract is trying to do." "There's not going to any judge." Anthony stepped away from the post with the quiet resolve of a man whose mind was set. "This ends today, inside the chapel, before anyone signs anything." Raymond looked at him for a moment. "And Isabella?" "Isabella keeps the land." Anthony's voice didn't waver. "The rest she'll learn to carry over time." They parted without another word, each returning to his role in the day's spectacle. The hour that followed was the longest hour of Anthony Alencar's life, and he had lived through enough long hours to know how to recognize one. The ranch was at peak commotion, guests changing clothes in borrowed bedrooms, the guitar player tuning his instrument under the oak tree, Mrs. Hilda moving around with platters of finger foods. No one could stop eating. Adult guests everywhere, greetings exchanged in the yard, the scents of flowers and cologne mingling in the warm Texas air. Anthony went to his room, closed the door, and stood before the mirror for a while. He adjusted the handkerchief in his dark suit jacket pocket, checked his buttons, examined his own face with the cold detachment required when there is no room for sentimentalism, the deep lines around his eyes, his hair completely white, his jaw holding firm even as the rest of his body bore the exhaustion of a sleepless night. It was the face of a 72-year-old man with a duty to fulfill. He was ready when Isabella knocked on the door. He opened it, and for a moment, just a brief moment, he paused. She was dressed in white from her neck to the floor, her veil secured by a simple arrangement of wildflowers she had chosen against the advice of all the women who urged her toward more elaborate styles. Around her neck hung the gold locket. In her eyes burned that light Anthony had last seen on his wife's face, in that photograph on his nightstand that he made a habit of looking at whenever he needed to remember why he did what he did. "Dad," she said, and the word came out with a gentleness Anthony felt deep in his chest. "My sweet girl," he replied. Isabella stepped forward and leaned into him with the care of someone trying not to wrinkle her dress, but with the strength of someone who truly needed that embrace. Anthony held her slowly, his large, calloused hands that had once taught this girl how to ride a horse, pick wild fruit, and face a storm without fear, wrapping around her. He closed his eyes. There was a moment in that embrace where he almost spoke, where the temptation to spill everything right there in the room before anything started was stronger than any reason could counter. But reason answered with the logic that had guided him all night. Without the document in hand, without physical proof before everyone, Roderick would have room to deny it. He would spin the revelation as a father's jealousy, overprotectiveness, or paranoia. And Isabella, 18 years old and madly in love, might choose the wrong side. Not now, not yet. He pulled back and looked at his daughter with a smile that cost him everything left of his emotional reserves. "You look so beautiful," he said, his voice steady. She smiled back, her eyes shining, and floated down the hallway with the grace of someone carrying no heavier burden than the flowers in her hair. The procession to the chapel took place to the sound of an acoustic violin someone had hired at the last minute, playing with a delicacy that matched the October afternoon almost painfully well. Guests lined up along the stone path leading from the main house to the small wooden door of the chapel, and Anthony walked among them with the firm stature of a welcoming host, nodding, accepting handshakes, answering questions with brief, composed replies. Roderick was already standing beside the altar when Anthony entered. He wore a dark suit, a white handkerchief in his pocket, his hair neatly styled. He looked, and this was what made it all the harder to stomach, exactly like what he had promised to be, a groom deeply in love. To anyone looking from the outside, that young man was nothing short of flawless. Anthony had realized that morning behind the bookcase that this was Roderick Palmer's true talent, the ability to be utterly convincing to anyone who didn't know where to look. The stone chapel was packed. The wooden pews, which the family had bought decades ago from an old church in Bourne, were filled on both sides. White flowers tucked into wall niches scented the enclosed air, with an intensity that felt almost physical. Sunbeams poured through the narrow windows in golden shafts, cutting through the space like stage lights. Anthony sat in the front row on the left side, as arranged by the wedding coordinator. Beside him sat a distant relative from Charleston he hadn't seen in years, who spent the first few minutes asking questions about the ranch that Anthony answered without really hearing. Across the center aisle, the Palmers, Eleanor in her pink dress and Ernest with his tie slightly crooked, sat with the air of people in a territory they didn't yet know well. Isabella walked through the chapel door to the sound of the violin, holding a bouquet of white carnations, and the entire room rose to its feet. Anthony stood up along with everyone else. He watched his daughter walk down the aisle with that effortless grace that had always been her trademark. He saw Roderick smile at the end of the aisle as she drew near. He saw the two of them take their places before the pastor, a gray-haired man named Father Benedict, whom Anthony had known for decades and who had baptized Isabella in that very chapel 18 years ago. Father Benedict opened the book with the quiet solemnity of men who have officiated enough weddings to know that each one is unique. He motioned for everyone to be seated. He waited for complete silence. And the silence in that stone chapel was thick, heavy, almost tangible. "We are gathered here today," the priest began, his voice filling the room effortlessly, "before God and this congregation to celebrate the union of Isabella and Roderick, a union that, like every true union, begins with the truth each person brings with them." Anthony sat utterly still in the front row. The truth each person brings with them. Father Benedict couldn't possibly know the weight those words carried at that specific moment, but they settled into Anthony's chest with the precision of a message meant solely for him, vibrating quietly as the ceremony progressed and the clock high on the chapel wall ticked away every second, with the patience of inanimate objects unaware of what is about to happen. Father Benedict's voice filled the stone chapel with the soft authority of a man who knows that silence listens. He spoke of the rings as symbols of continuity, of a perfect circle with no beginning and no end, and Anthony heard every word with the attention of someone who knows a language but, at that specific moment, was hearing a translation no one else in the room could make. From his seat in the front row he could see both of them in profile. Isabella with her bouquet held in both hands, her posture straight, her eyes fixed on the groom's face, with the intense focus of someone recording every detail to carry forever. Roderick beside her, impeccable posture, shoulders slightly back, chin held at a height that communicated exactly what he intended. Confidence, belonging, the natural ease of someone who acted as though he had always known this was where he belonged. Anthony took a deep breath through his nose and let it out slowly. In the second row on the right, between the Palmers and a neighboring ranching couple, Mr. Fletcher sat with the black leather folder on his lap. Anthony had noticed him when he walked in. He had also noticed how the lawyer had chosen a side seat that gave him a direct line of sight to the altar, without placing him in the immediate view of the other guests. It was a small detail, the kind of detail that only exists when planned in advance. Father Benedict moved to the reading. It was a passage Anthony knew by heart, having heard it at other weddings in other times, with other couples before the altar. But this time the words arrived filtered through everything he knew, and every sentence meant to speak of love spoke to him instead, of the chasm between what is promised and what is real. He listened with two sets of ears at once, a father's ears, feeling every word as a tightening in his chest, and a man's ears, having made a decision and waiting for the exact right moment to carry it out. The reading ended. The pastor paused respectfully. Outside, through the narrow window, the Texas sky was still, as it often gets on October afternoons, when the wind dies down before a storm. It was in that silence that Anthony saw it. Roderick, without turning his head, flicked his eyes to the right for a fraction of a second, just enough to catch Fletcher's eye in the side pew. There was no gesture, no visible signal to anyone not watching with precise attention. But there was a language in that shared glance that Anthony recognized, with the clarity of a man who had spent decades around men, making deals without uttering a word. Everything was in order. The confirmation passed between them in an instant, and Roderick returned his gaze to the front with the same composure as before. Anthony remained motionless. There was something he had learned very early on, something the land teaches in a way no school ever could. The most effective predator isn't the one that strikes fast, but the one that waits without the other realizing he is waiting. Roderick was good at it. He had the patience of a man who had planned every step months in advance, but he had made the mistake cold planners make when they get too close to completing their scheme. He had underestimated the silence on the other side. The rings were brought forward on a white satin pillow by a young relative of the Palmers, who performed the duty with excessive seriousness. Father Benedict blessed them with brief words and raised his eyes to the couple. "Roderick," the pastor said, "do you take Isabella to be your lawful wedded wife, promising to love her, honor her, and be faithful to her in all circumstances of life?" "I do," Roderick said with a firmness that sounded far too sweet to be simple. "Isabella," Father Benedict continued, "do you take Roderick to be your lawful wedded husband, promising to love him, honor him, and be faithful to him in all circumstances of life?" Isabella turned her face toward Roderick before answering. It was a small, instinctive gesture, the gesture of someone who wants to look into a person's eyes while making the most important promise of her life. And in that movement, for a brief split second, Isabella's profile became visible to Anthony. Her eyes shining, her breathing slightly faster than normal, and in that sparkle lay all the purity and innocence of an 18-year-old who had put her trust in the wrong place. "I do," she said, her voice clear and firm. Anthony closed his eyes. Not out of weakness, out of restraint, because there was something in those 3 seconds that cost more than anything else the day had exacted, more than the sleepless night, more than the photographs of the contract, more than the conversation overheard behind the bookcase. It was the specific cost of being a father, hearing his daughter make a promise with her whole heart, with her entire soul, to someone who didn't deserve even the first syllable of that vow. He opened his eyes as the rings were exchanged. He watched Isabella's hands accept the ring with that subtle tremor her fingers had always shown whenever she was deeply moved. Ever since she was a little girl, when she received something she had wished for fiercely, her fingers betrayed how much she was feeling. He watched Roderick's hands slip the ring on with clinical precision, disguised as tenderness. He watched the moment their hands met, and the young man held them with the calculated pressure of someone who knows he is being watched. The room was dead quiet. Surrounding them was that collective air of suspended reality that weddings produce, a temporary spell where the everyday world vanishes and only the present moment exists. Eleanor, Roderick's mother, had teary eyes and clutched an embroidered handkerchief between her fingers. The distant relative from Charleston beside Anthony held his breath. Mrs. Hilda, in the back of the chapel, had her hands clasped over her chest with that silent devotion that was her hallmark during moments that mattered. Anthony watched them all with the strange sensation of being inside a glass box and outside of it at the same time. To those people, the ceremony was exactly what it appeared to be, and he was the only person in that room who knew it wasn't. Raymond leaned against the side wall near the entrance, arms crossed, wearing the neutral expression of a man on duty at a party. His eyes met Anthony's for a split second. No longer than that, no longer was needed. Nothing was said. Everything was understood. Father Benedict turned a page in the book he held with both hands and adjusted his glasses on his nose with the accustomed gesture of a man preparing for the final portion of something he took seriously. There was a different quality to the silence that preceded his next words, heavier, more charged, as if the chapel itself knew that something was about to be uttered that could never be taken back once spoken. The pastor raised his eyes to the congregation. The late afternoon sun poured through the narrow windows at a low angle, that specific hill country light that shows no mercy to shadows and illuminates everything with an unsparing frankness. The white carnations in the wall niches cast soft outlines on the stone floor. The clock on the wall kept its unyielding pace, indifferent to what was happening beneath it. Anthony felt his lungs expand in a breath deeper than the ones before. His body was preparing itself, without needing instructions. "Before we proceed to the final blessing," Father Benedict said, his voice measured and solemn, reserved for words that deserve to be weighed, "it is customary to ask those present, if anyone here knows any lawful impediment why these two should not be joined together, let them speak now." The silence that followed lasted less than 2 seconds. But it was during those 2 seconds that Anthony Alencar, 72 years old, Texas rancher, a man who had built everything with his own hands and who held one single thing in the world more precious than the land, placed the palms of his hands on the back of the pew in front of him and began to stand up. If Anthony's quiet courage before this altar touched something in you, subscribe to the channel. It's a simple gesture that truly helps our work. And stay with us, because what he is about to say will cause this chapel to hold a silence it has never held before. The entire chapel froze. It wasn't a gradual freeze. It was the sudden stop that happens when something unexpected interrupts the rhythm of a ritual everyone believed they knew by heart. Father Benedict lowered the book slightly, without closing it, and looked at Anthony with the expression of a man who doesn't yet know whether he is witnessing an intrusion or a mistake. Roderick turned around, his smile still plastered on his face, the reflex of someone who had trained his composure to the point where it was his body's first response to any situation. Isabella turned as well, and on her face was a look Anthony had never seen on his daughter before. Surprise mixed with the beginning of something she couldn't yet put a name to. "Mr. Alencar," Father Benedict said, his voice low as he tried to manage a situation for which the book contained no clear instruction. "Do you wish to speak?" "I do," Anthony said. A single syllable, but it was enough to completely extinguish the whisper that had begun to ripple through the guests. The silence that settled in was the kind that admits nothing other than what is about to be said. Anthony released his grip on the pew and stood tall, holding the posture of a man who doesn't need height to command space. There was no anger in his expression, no tremor in his voice. There was only the calm of a man who had waited for the right moment and arrived at it without losing anything along the way. "I know an impediment." The room stopped breathing. Father Benedict stood motionless, the book half closed in his hand. Roderick kept his smile for a few seconds longer, but it was a smile that began to rot from the inside out, like ice cracking before it gives way. Isabella took an involuntary step toward her father, then stopped, as if her feet had received conflicting orders at the same time. "Dad," she whispered, barely a breath. Anthony didn't look at his daughter right away. He looked at Roderick, and it was that look, direct, unheated, devoid of hostility, yet lucid and unyielding, that made the young man realize for the first time since stepping foot on that ranch that the ground beneath his feet had shifted without him noticing when. "Anthony," Roderick said, his voice still controlled, still holding that soft cadence he used to smooth over misunderstandings. "With all due respect, I don't know what's happening, but perhaps this isn't the time." "This is precisely the time," Anthony replied without raising his voice. "There is no other." He turned to Father Benedict with a subtle nod. "Pastor, I ask permission to exercise the right you yourself offered. I have something to say to this congregation before this ceremony is concluded." Father Benedict looked from Anthony to Roderick, then to Isabella, and finally across the chapel filled with faces watching him with the intense focus of people witnessing something they know will be remembered. The pastor made a subtle gesture with his hand, not quite an authorization, but a recognition that the moment had passed beyond the bounds of ritual protocol. Anthony turned toward the aisle. He didn't walk to the altar. He stood where he was in the front row, positioned so he could be seen by the majority of those present without turning his back on anyone who mattered. "Tomorrow morning," he began, his voice calibrated to reach every corner of the chapel without straining. "As soon as this ceremony was over, my daughter was to be brought to sign a set of documents. Documents that Roderick described to her this morning as an instrument for joint asset protection." Pause. "They are no such thing." The whisper that swept through the pews was fast and involuntary, like a wave that asks no permission. Eleanor, Roderick's mother, squeezed the handkerchief in her hands. Ernest, beside her, kept his eyes fixed on the floor. Mr. Fletcher in the side pew didn't move, but a stiffness in his right shoulder revealed that maintaining composure was costing him. "What those documents do," Anthony continued in the same flat, precise tone, "is transfer ownership of a substantial portion of this ranch to a company registered in Austin 7 months ago. A company whose name lies buried on page 4 of a technical contract, phrased in language chosen specifically not to be understood by someone signing in full trust without time to read it." Roderick took a step forward. The smile was completely gone. In its place was an expression Anthony hadn't seen on that face before. Not anger, not fear, but the frantic calculation of someone searching for the emergency exit while trying to appear firmly planted. "Anthony, this is a—" "I will have your time to speak," the rancher said with a firmness that wasn't an interruption but a closure. "Right now I am speaking." Roderick stood frozen. There is something that happens to men accustomed to controlling their environment when that control is stripped away without warning, a kind of disorientation that isn't physical but manifests physically. The posture that had been so carefully practiced for months showed a fracture. His shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. His hands, which had been crossed with rehearsed composure, slipped into his pockets, the involuntary gesture of someone looking for a place to put what he no longer knows how to handle. "This company," Anthony went on, "has as a partner the lawyer who arrived with you today. The man introduced as a family friend, sitting right there in that pew holding a black leather folder containing the 6 pages of a contract my daughter should never have been handed." Eyes swung to the side pew like a tide. Mr. Fletcher looked up from the floor for the first time, and what showed in his eyes wasn't serenity. It was the look of a man realizing his name had just been spoken aloud in a room full of witnesses. Isabella stood motionless at the altar, her bouquet still in her hands, and Anthony saw, without looking directly at her, that the bouquet had dropped several inches, her arms losing their strength, while her head tried to process what her ears were receiving. It was the stance of someone still standing, but beginning to need support. "Dad," she said again, and this time there was a crack in her voice he knew well, having heard that exact crack when she was a little girl discovering that something in the world wasn't what she believed it to be. Anthony looked at his daughter, and it was the first time since standing up that his composure cost him something visible, a brief tightening around his eyes, a momentary weight that crossed his expression before being pulled back. "I know this hurts," he said, using the voice reserved only for her, "and I need you to hear me out to the end." Isabella said nothing, but she didn't look away. Roderick tried again, and this time his voice carried a tone that hadn't appeared in any of the interactions Anthony had witnessed, the barely contained tension of a man losing control of the narrative and knowing it. "What your father is doing," he said, turning to Isabella with urgency, "is a misunderstanding. These documents exist, yes, and I was going to explain every single clause to you before any signature." He jumped to conclusions without— "Raymond," Anthony said simply. The rancher's voice didn't need volume. It needed only the name. Raymond pushed off the side wall where he had been standing since the start of the ceremony and walked down the center aisle with his usual slow, deliberate steps. In his hand, his phone screen glowed, open to the first of the photographs he had taken before dawn, with the discretion of a man who knows a single image can be worth more than an hour of words. He stopped beside Anthony and held out the device toward the center of the chapel, not to Roderick, not to the pastor, but into the space between everyone, into the air of the room, like someone presenting evidence to the only court that mattered at that moment. The congregation of people who had come to celebrate a union and were about to understand what they had almost witnessed. Roderick looked at the phone, and for the first time in all the months Anthony had observed him, Roderick Palmer's face was left without a ready answer. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it was the kind of silence that has weight, the kind you feel in your shoulders and at the base of your throat. Roderick looked at the phone in Raymond's hand, then at Anthony, then back at the phone, and in that triangle of glances something happened that the entire chapel witnessed without anyone needing to name it. The moment a man realizes the ground he thought he commanded is no longer his. Father Benedict reached out with a subtle motion, and Raymond handed the phone to the pastor. The old priest stared at the screen for a few seconds, scrolling through the photos with his thumb with the gravity of a man who knows what he is seeing matters, even if he doesn't grasp every technical detail. Then he passed the device to the front pew, not to Roderick, not to Isabella, but into the space where people of good faith were seated, so the evidence could circulate among the witnesses as it always should, in the light of day before everyone. Roderick tried once more, and this time there was something different in his voice, an edge that hadn't shown in any of the dinners, any of the conversations, any of the studied gestures of the past few months. It was the edge of someone who had bet everything on a single hand and felt the table collapsing beneath him. "What your father is doing," he said, turning to Isabella with an urgency he could no longer fully hide, "is exactly what he's always done. Controlling you, deciding for you, treating you like you're incapable of making your own choices." He paused, reaching for the cord that had worked so many times before. "Don't you see it? He never accepted that you might want a life beyond this ranch." Isabella didn't answer right away. She was looking at her fiancé with an expression Anthony couldn't quite name. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was something closer to the rapt attention of someone listening to a familiar voice and realizing, for the first time, that she didn't recognize what it was saying. Anthony wasn't fazed by the attack. He had expected it. It was the predictable response of someone who has run out of arguments regarding the facts and needs to change the subject. "My daughter has every right to make her own choices," he said, his voice unhurried, "and she will continue to have that right after this conversation ends. What she does not have is the right to be deceived while making those choices. That is a very different thing." He turned back to the congregation. "There is a second point this room needs to know." He paused briefly, not for dramatic effect, but because the next part needed space to settle with the exactness it deserved. Roderick presented himself to this family as coming from a long line of ranchers in the southern part of the state. He described to my daughter properties, tradition, a name that carried history. He asked for her hand under that representation. Roderick opened his mouth. "That family does not exist," Anthony said before a single word could be spoken. The whisper that swept through the chapel this time was different from the last. Longer, more scattered, like a wave that doesn't quite know where to land. "What does exist," Anthony continued, "is a family from Waco who shares the same last name by coincidence, having no connection whatsoever to what was described. There is no registered ranch. There is no cattle. There is no estate that was presented as the foundation for this union." He looked straight at Roderick. "My manager verified this personally. I have the documentation." Raymond, beside Anthony, unfolded the papers from the brown envelope he had kept in his inner suit pocket since morning. He didn't flaunt them like a trophy. He placed them on the pew beside him with the simplicity of a man depositing proof where it could be seen. Eleanor, Roderick's mother, covered her mouth with her handkerchief. Ernest, beside her, closed his eyes like a man who preferred not to be present for what was taking place. Mr. Fletcher, in the side pew, had retreated into a stillness that was, in itself, a confession. Roderick stood speechless for a moment. There was something in his expression Anthony had never seen on that face. Not the mask, not the smile, not the calculation. There was a genuine crack, and through that crack emerged something that looked like rage, but which Anthony recognized after looking closely, as something that precedes rage. The humiliation of a man who has been truly seen for the first time and discovers he doesn't like what the other person's gaze found. "Isabella," Roderick said, and this time his voice had shifted tone completely. He was no longer the devotion-filled fiancé, no longer the composed strategist. He was a 22-year-old who had bet high and was watching the stakes get swept off the table. "You know I love you. You know what we have is real, regardless of anything that—" "Roderick," the voice came from Isabella, and everything stopped. It wasn't a loud voice. It was, in truth, quieter than normal, holding that specific quality of voices that shrink when carrying too much weight. But there was a composure in it that surprised even Anthony, who knew his daughter better than anyone else in that room. Isabella looked at her fiancé for a long moment. She looked with those eyes she had used to admire him, to defend him, to believe in him with the intensity one reserves for things chosen with conviction. And it was in a moment hard to pinpoint precisely when, like when the light shifts and what was in front of you all along suddenly becomes visible in a different way, that her expression changed. Her hand went to the gold locket around her neck. Her fingers touched the metal with the care given to things that have just acquired a new meaning. And then her hand slid down slowly, without letting go of the locket, just holding it. "The family grandmother," she said, her voice still learning what it was saying. "You told me it belonged to your family's grandmother." Roderick didn't answer. His silence was a more complete answer than any words could have been. Isabella let go of the locket. The bouquet of white carnations, which she had held in both hands at her waist since the beginning of the ceremony, slowly sank until it hung by her fingers, the blossoms pointing down toward the stone floor. She didn't drop it, but it was the movement of a body redistributing the weight it was bearing, searching for where to put what it no longer knew how to carry. Roderick took a step toward her. No. Isabella's word wasn't loud, but it was absolute. Final in the way only words spoken when someone decides in real time who she is going to be on the other side of heartache can be. Roderick stopped. The chapel remained completely motionless. Father Benedict held the closed book in his hands. The guests were a portrait of mixed expressions: shock, compassion, confusion, the peculiar embarrassment of those witnessing an event never meant to be public, and that was now impossible to pretend hadn't been seen. Mrs. Hilda, in the back, had her eyes closed and her lips moving in a whisper that reached no ear. Anthony stood where he was. He didn't rush to his daughter. He didn't wrap an arm around her. He didn't make the gesture a father's instinct urged him to make, because Isabella had just done something on her own. She had made a choice on her own. She had stood tall on her own. And the only thing a father's love knew how to respect at that moment was precisely that: the space his daughter had claimed for herself. He looked at Roderick one last time. "You can leave this property now," Anthony said, his voice needing no anger to be irrevocable, "and you can take Mr. Fletcher with you." If the moment Isabella looked at Roderick and finally saw what was right in front of her broke something in you too, subscribe to the channel. It's a simple gesture that truly helps our work. And stay with us, because what matters most is still to come. What happens when the storm passes and father and daughter are left alone with the truth? Roderick stood frozen for 3-4 seconds that felt far longer than they were. In his expression was something the entire chapel saw without wanting to see. The moment a man who built a version of himself for the world realizes that version is no longer standing. The smile was gone. The posture was gone. There was only a 22-year-old young man in a well-tailored suit, in the middle of a stone aisle, with every exit path visible, and none of them dignified. He turned on his heel without another word. Mr. Fletcher stood up from the side pew, grabbed his black leather folder with a gesture meant to be discreet, that was observed by everyone, and followed Roderick out the chapel door with the quick steps of a man who knows that haste reveals less than silence. Eleanor followed behind, her handkerchief squeezed tightly in her hands and her eyes fixed on the floor. Ernest was the last, and before stepping outside he turned briefly back toward the chapel interior with an expression that was neither defense nor accusation. It was the quiet shame of those who had been used as props and only understood it when the curtain came down. The wooden door closed with its usual soft click. The silence that remained inside the chapel was different from every silence before it. It lacked the tension of the before. It lacked the weight of the during. It was the silence of the after, quiet, open, slightly stunned, like the air that lingers in a room when too much has happened at once, and the space doesn't yet know what to do with what it witnessed. Father Benedict closed his book completely for the first time since the ceremony had begun, and stood before the altar, hands folded over it. He looked at Anthony with the expression of a man who had been surprised enough by life not to need elaborate words. "God moves in ways no script foresees," the pastor said, with the simple ease of someone who had found over decades the right phrase for situations that have no right phrase. Anthony acknowledged him with a faint nod. The guests slowly began to rise, exchanging glances, leaving in small groups with the care of people who realize the space needs to be returned to those who will need it. There was no rush, no commotion. There was that collective, instinctive grace that sometimes surfaces in people when a moment is large enough for good sense to appear unbidden. Mrs. Hilda was among the last to leave, and as she passed Anthony, she rested a hand on his arm for a second, just a second, and walked out without saying a word. Raymond gathered the phone and the papers, tucked everything into his pocket with his usual precision, and slipped out the side door with the steps that had always been his, slow, deliberate, unhurried. Before rounding the corner, he looked at Anthony one last time. The rancher gave a barely perceptible nod. "Thank you, go on, I've got this," and Raymond disappeared. Isabella hadn't moved. She stood in the exact spot where she had been throughout the ceremony, facing the empty altar. her bouquet of white carnations now resting completely against her side, the flowers nearly touching the stone floor. The gold locket reflected the light streaming through the narrow windows, and in that reflection lay something that looked to Anthony like an irony the afternoon had casually invented. He approached her slowly, not in a rush, not driven by a need to fix things, not requiring words to mend what had been broken, because there are things that cannot be mended, that require only time and presence. He stood beside his daughter and stayed there with her, looking at the same empty altar. For a long time they stood like that, side by side, in the silence that exists only between people who know each other deeply enough not to need to fill it. It was Isabella who spoke first, and her voice was strange. It wasn't her ceremony voice, it wasn't her bright morning laugh, it wasn't any of the voices Anthony had heard from her that day. It was a new voice, being tested as it was spoken. "How long did you know?" "I started suspecting a few weeks ago," Anthony said without hesitating. "I knew for sure last night when Raymond brought me what he'd uncovered, and I heard everything this morning in the office, hidden behind the bookcase when he walked in with the lawyer." Isabella turned her head slowly to look at him. "You were hiding?" "I was." She stared at him for a moment. In her expression were layers Anthony knew it would take him time to learn to read, because this was an Isabella being forged in that very moment, distinct from every version that came before. "Oh, you could have told me sooner," she said. "Last night, this morning, before all of this happened in here, in front of everyone." "I could have," Anthony agreed, not looking away. "I thought about it. I stood in the hallway listening to your footsteps in your room upstairs, and I thought about it for a long time." "And why didn't you?" Anthony took a breath. "Because you would have asked me for proof, and at that moment I didn't have the last page of the document. Without it, he could have argued it was a misunderstanding, that I was making things up, that I was just a jealous father, and you—" He paused, offering the honesty his daughter deserved. "You would have wanted to believe him, not out of stupidity, out of love, and love demands greater proof than suspicion." Isabella didn't answer immediately. She stared at the altar for a long while, wearing the stillness of someone processing multiple truths at once and knowing she couldn't rush any of them. "I loved him," she said at last. And it wasn't a question nor a defense. It was simply the statement of a truth she still needed to speak aloud to believe she could live with it. "My part was real. What I felt was real." "It was," Anthony said simply, "and it remains what it is. No one forged your part, it was entirely yours." Something in that sentence, perhaps its exactness, perhaps the fact that it was the one thing left whole that day, made Isabella's eyes fill with tears. It wasn't an immediate breakdown. It was the slow welling up that happens when the body finally receives permission to feel what it had been holding back since her father stood up from his pew. Her hand went to the locket. This time her fingers didn't just touch it, they unclasped the latch with a movement both delicate and final, and the locket slid into her palm until it rested there, small and golden and completely emptied of what it had been when it entered that chapel in the morning. Isabella stared down at it for a second. Then she placed it on the ledge of the nearest window, with the care given to items that belong to someone who no longer exists. Anthony said nothing. There was nothing to say that could be larger than the gesture. They left the chapel together as the light began to shift its angle, signaling that late afternoon was yielding to twilight. The yard had been partially cleared. Someone had packed away the table centerpieces. Someone had folded the ribbons from the trees. There was on the ranch that specific feeling of the aftermath of a celebration that never happened. Interrupted organization, flowers still in place but stripped of the purpose for which they were planted, music that had never played leaving a quiet void in the warm Texas air. They walked to the porch of the main house in silence. They sat in the same seats where, at other times, on other afternoons, they had sat gazing at the horizon without needing to explain why it was enough. The sun was dipping behind the limestone hills, with that generous grace peculiar to day's end in the hill country. A light in no hurry accompanying the horizon to the final moment before departing. Isabella rested her head on her father's shoulder with the exact weight of exhaustion that comes from having just crossed something too massive to be classified yet. Anthony stayed still and let her. Down below, The pond reflected the orange of the sky with the calm of a body of water that never runs dry. The barbed wire fences stood in place. The 1,200 acres of tamed country stood in place. And on the porch, father and daughter sat watching it all, with the silence of two people who had lost and preserved too much on the very same day, to know yet what to feel first. But they were together. And the ranch, which had witnessed generations of power and accumulated secrets, now bore witness to something different. The beginning, still tender and fragile like all things that truly begin, of a conversation that should have happened long before. The stars appeared over the hills one by one, with the patience of things that don't need to be announced to exist. The air had cooled slightly, not the cold of winter, but that specific temperature of October nights in the Texas hill country when the day's heat gently recedes, leaving in its place a breeze smelling of damp brush and earth holding on to the sun. Isabella and Anthony remained on the porch. The silence between them had shifted quality over the past few hours. It had ceased to be the silence of exhaustion and become the silence of two people reaching the edge of what the day had revealed and looking out toward the other side. Mrs. Hilda had brought coffee without being asked, set the mugs on the small table between the chairs, and stepped back inside without a word, the gesture of caring without intruding, which was the most precise form of love she knew. Isabella held her mug with both hands and stared out at the pond shimmering faintly under the starlight. "Tell me about her," she said at last. Anthony didn't need to ask who her was. He had waited for this request without knowing he was waiting. For decades, perhaps, he had held his wife's memory so carefully that he had never found the right time to speak her name to his daughter in the way it deserved to be spoken. Her name was Mary Louise, he said, and in those few words there was something releasing, like opening a window that had been closed for a long time, letting in air of a different quality. Isabella turned her head slowly to look at her father. "I know her name, Dad." "I know you do." Anthony looked out at the horizon. "But I never told you what she was really like. I kept so much of it to myself for so long that sometimes I was afraid the memories were only mine, and that when I left, they'd leave too." The silence that followed was different from all the rest. It was the silence of something being opened for the very first time. "She was stubborn," Anthony said, and in his voice was a tone Isabella hadn't heard before in her father, lightness. Stubborn in a way it took me years to learn to distinguish from bravery. She wouldn't budge on anything she thought was right, no matter who was on the other side. And sometimes she was wrong. But even when she was wrong, her stance was so absolute that you were left wondering whether you should argue or simply admire her. Isabella listened without interrupting. "When she passed away," Anthony continued, "you were 2 years old, and I was left with the ranch, with you, and with fear." He paused. The fear stayed a long time. It stayed too long. "Fear of what?" "Of losing you, too." The sentence was simple, direct, unornamented. You were all that was left that I loved with that intensity, and I didn't know how to do anything other than hold on tight. Hold on so tight that I ended up never letting you learn how to fall. Isabella stayed silent for a moment. In her father's words was an acknowledgement she hadn't expected to receive that day, on that porch, after everything that had happened. And sometimes the unexpected is precisely what fits into the space that pain opens up. "You were so afraid of losing me," she said slowly, like someone thinking out loud, "that you couldn't let me figure anything out on my own. And so I went and figured things out with the wrong person." Anthony didn't answer immediately. He let the sentence hang in the air between them with the weight it deserved. "Yes," he said at last, "that's it." It was the first time in 72 years of a life built on the conviction of his own choices that Anthony Alencar had said yes to an accusation against himself without reservation, without explanation, without the armor of justifying context. And there was something in that yes that weighed differently from every other word spoken that day. Isabella looked down at her hands for a moment. "But I stood my ground," she said. "Back in there, when he came to me and I said no, I said it on my own." "You did," Anthony confirmed. "I needed you to know that I realized it." The rancher looked at his daughter with that deep attention that sometimes feels more like listening than seeing. "I noticed," he said. "It was the most important thing that happened today, not what I said, what you said." Isabella raised her eyes to the horizon with the expression of someone learning in real time, something about herself she would need time to learn how to use fully. There was pain in that expression, the clean pain of someone who had lost something she loved and knew grief would take its time. But there was also beneath the pain something Anthony recognized because he had seen it before, in his wife's eyes, in that photograph on his nightstand, and which had no simple name, but could be called, for lack of a more precise one, wholeness. They sat in silence for a while longer, the two of them, as the Texas hills sank deeper into the dark around the ranch. In the distance, an owl hooted once and fell silent. Raymond rounded the side of the house with his usual steps, slow, deliberate, unannounced, and stopped at the foot of the porch like a man checking if he was welcome before stepping closer. Anthony made a hand gesture that was both an invitation and a dismissal. "Come, but you don't need to stay." The manager climbed the 2 steps and stood at the edge of the porch. "The property is secure," he said simply. "The flowers are put away, everyone left without trouble." "Thank you, Raymond," Anthony said. The manager nodded. He looked at Isabella with an expression that wasn't pity. It was the quiet respect of someone who saw someone do a hard thing and wasn't going to pretend he hadn't seen it. Then he stepped down the stairs and disappeared into the dark yard with the same discretion with which he had arrived. Isabella watched the spot where he had been standing. "Did he know before you?" she asked. "He was the one who brought me what I needed, to be sure." Anthony paused. "Raymond has carried this ranch alongside me for over 20 years. Some things he sees before I do because he's standing at a different angle. I never realized that about him." "You never needed to." Anthony looked at his daughter. "But you will from here on out. You'll need to learn who the people are who are truly on your side, and Raymond is one of them." Isabella nodded slowly. In that nod was something different from her earlier ones that day, not automatic agreement but deliberation. It was an 18-year-old young woman deciding, consciously, to begin building the map of true loyalties around herself. Night had settled completely over the countryside when Isabella finally stood up from her chair. She reached out and picked up her empty coffee mug from the table, making that small domestic gesture with the natural ease of someone who belongs in a place, not as a decoration but as a living part of it. "I'm going to sleep," she said. "We need to talk more, not tonight, but we need to." "We do," Anthony agreed. She walked to the door, paused with her hand on the wood, and turned back to her father still sitting on the porch. "Dad." Her voice was calm, holding that new quality that had surfaced inside the chapel and seemed to be staying. "I'm not okay, but I'm going to be." Anthony looked at his daughter for a second that felt longer than it was. "I know," he said. "You're your mother's daughter." Isabella smiled, not the broad, carefree smile of the morning, but a smaller, more honest smile, the kind that appears only when someone receives the exact word she needed. She stepped through the door and vanished down the warm, lit hallway of the house. Anthony was left alone on the porch. He stayed like that for a long while, with the 1,200 acres of hill country before him, bathed in darkness, the pond glowing faintly, and the barbed wire fences invisible but unmistakably in place. The ranch surrounded him, the same ranch, the same smell of earth and night flowers, the same horizon he had learned by heart over decades. But there was also, on that specific night, a different quality to the silence. It wasn't the silence of the night before, heavy, tense, steeped in secrets that needed the dark to be kept. It was the silence of the after, the silence of a ranch that had seen the worst and the best of a family in a single day and remained standing, as it had remained standing for generations, with the dignified indifference of things built to last. Anthony took off his hat and set it on his lap. He tilted his head back slightly and looked up at the stars for a time he didn't count. The land was whole. His daughter was inside the house. The truth had cost what it usually costs, and had given what it usually gives, to those who have the courage and the patience to wait for it until the end. Dear listeners, we hope Anthony and Isabella's story touched something true in you. To continue this journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories. Find it right here by clicking to the side. If this narrative was worth your time, subscribe to the channel and leave a like on the video. It's a small gesture that means a great deal to our work and allows us to keep bringing you stories like this every day. And tell us in the comments, what was the moment in this story that stuck with you the most? We're waiting for you there.